Welcome to a story unlike any other in European history. How does a strip of wind-swept marshland along the Baltic Sea, inhabited by pagan tribes trading amber through sacred groves, become the most feared military machine on the continent? How does a crusader state founded by armored monks transform century by century into a kingdom so disciplined, so relentlessly efficient, that it forges an entire nation from dozens of fractured territories? And how does that kingdom grow so powerful that it literally creates modern Germany, only to be erased from the map entirely, abolished by decree in 1947, as though 7 centuries of history could be struck from existence with a single document? This is the paradox of Prussia, and its story is far stranger, far more dramatic, and far more consequential than most people realize. We are about to follow the complete arc of this extraordinary state, from its very beginning to its very end. We will start with the old Prussians themselves, the Baltic people whose name would be taken by the very power that destroyed their world. We will march alongside the Teutonic Knights as they raise the red brick fortress of Malbec and carve a theocratic domain from conquered wilderness. We will watch the Hohenzollern dynasty slowly, patiently stitch together scattered territories across northern Europe into something cohesive and dangerous. We will stand in the austere court of the soldier-king, where every coin was counted and every grenadier measured for height. We will hear Frederick the Great play his flute at Sanssouci by evening and command cavalry charges at Leuthen by morning. We will witness Napoleon shatter old Prussia at Jena and then watch reformers rebuild it from the wreckage into something even more formidable. We will follow Bismarck as he engineers 3 wars in 7 years to unite Germany through blood and iron, and we will see how the state that created Germany was ultimately consumed by it, hollowed out by dictatorship, and finally abolished by the victors of the Second World War. But this is not only a story of kings and generals. We will walk through Junker estates at harvest time, sit in Prussian schoolrooms where discipline began in childhood, and follow bureaucrats through ministries where administrative precision became an art form. We will explore Berlin as it grew from a provincial town into one of Europe's great capitals, alive with philosophy, music, science, and contradiction. Prussia matters because its legacies did not vanish with its abolition. German administrative culture, debates about obedience and duty, the architecture of Berlin, the very borders of modern Europe, all carry Prussian fingerprints. Understanding Prussia means understanding how efficiency can build greatness and how discipline, unchecked, can enable catastrophe. If you find yourself drawn to the complete stories of the powers that shaped our world, please subscribe and join us each week as we bring you another full journey through history. Now, let us step back to the amber-lit shores of the Baltic, centuries before the first crusader set foot on this land, and let us begin. Long before the name Prussia belonged to any kingdom, before iron discipline and military parades defined its meaning, the word carried a different sound entirely. It belonged to a people. The Prusai, the old Prussians, inhabited the southeastern shore of the Baltic Sea for millennia, dwelling in a landscape of dense forest, slow rivers, coastal lagoons, and wind-swept dunes stretching from the Vistula to the Nemunas. Their world was ancient, rooted in rhythms that predated written record, and it would endure largely unchanged until the 13th century brought catastrophe. The land itself shaped everything. Thick stands of oak, linden, and pine covered the interior, broken by marshes and lakes that made overland travel treacherous for outsiders. The coastline offered something extraordinary. Amber, hardened resin from prehistoric forests washed ashore after storms, golden and translucent, prized across the ancient world. Roman merchants knew this coast as the source of the precious substance, and trade routes carried Baltic amber southward to the Mediterranean long before the Common Era. Greek writers spoke of a distant northern shore, where the sun's tears solidified into stone. That shore belonged to the old Prussians. They were a Western Baltic people, linguistically related to the Lithuanians and Latvians, speaking a tongue that would leave only fragments behind. Their society was tribal, organized into loosely connected clans occupying distinct territories. There was no central king, no unified Prussian state. Authority rested with local chieftains and a powerful priestly class who maintained the sacred traditions binding communities together. This decentralization gave Prussian culture remarkable resilience across centuries, but it would prove a fatal weakness when a centralized military force arrived at their borders. The sacred groves stood at the heart of old Prussian spiritual life. Towering oaks served as temples beneath open sky. The most revered site, Romoe, functioned as the spiritual center of the Prussian world, tended by a high priest whose authority transcended tribal boundaries. Here, eternal flames burned before images of the gods. Perkins, the thunder deity, commanded storms and justice. Patrempas governed fertility and flowing water. Patulas presided over the dead and the underworld. Animals were sacrificed, and the natural world was understood as alive with sacred presence. Springs, groves, serpents, and certain stones all carried spiritual meaning. Daily existence followed seasonal patterns shaped by agriculture, fishing, and animal husbandry. Prussian settlements were modest clusters of timber longhouses surrounded by cultivated fields of barley and rye. Horses held particular importance, both practical and ceremonial. Beekeeping produced mead, the drink of ritual gatherings. Coastal communities harvested amber and traded it for metals, salt, and goods from distant lands. Inland fortifications, built on hilltops and reinforced with timber and earth, served as refuges during raids. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the old Prussians faced mounting pressure. Polish dukes to the south and west sought to expand Christian influence into pagan territory. Missionary efforts met fierce resistance. A Cistercian monk named Christian of Oliva attempted conversion through preaching in the early 1200s, achieving limited success before Prussian raids into Polish borderlands provoked a decisive response. The Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia, unable to defend his own frontier, made a fateful decision. He invited a military religious order already hardened by crusading warfare in the Holy Land to solve his Prussian problem. The Teutonic Knights accepted. In 1226, Emperor Frederick II issued the Golden Bull of Rimini, granting the order sovereign authority over any Prussian lands they could conquer. The old Prussians, with no unified command, no heavy cavalry, and no stone fortifications, stood on the edge of an annihilation they could not yet imagine. Their amber coast, their sacred groves, their ancient gods and ancestral customs had endured for thousands of years in the quiet forests along the Baltic. That long silence was about to end. They came from the south in the year 1231, a small column of armored brothers crossing the Vistula into a wilderness they intended to remake. The Teutonic Knights brought with them not only swords and crossbows, but a systematic method of conquest perfected during decades of crusading warfare in the Levant. Their strategy was architectural as much as military. They would advance, build a fortress, garrison it, then advance again. Each stronghold became a permanent scar upon the land, a stone anchor from which the next wave of subjugation would radiate outward. The first fortification rose at Thorn, overlooking the river crossing. Then Kulm, then Marienwerder, each castle commanding a stretch of waterway or forest passage. The knights understood that controlling rivers meant controlling movement, trade, and escape. Prussian tribes who had never confronted stone walls or disciplined heavy cavalry found their woodland tactics increasingly futile against enemies who refused to leave. The conquest unfolded in grinding phases across 5 decades. The order targeted one tribal region at a time, exploiting divisions among Prussian clans who had never formed a unified political structure. The Pomesanians fell first, their territory closest to the Vistula bridgeheads. Then the Pogozzanians, the Warmians, the Natangians. Each campaign followed a brutal pattern. Knights and their recruited crusader volunteers from across Europe would burn villages, destroy grain stores, and slaughter livestock until starvation forced submission. Baptism followed surrender. Those who accepted Christianity received limited rights under the order's governance. Those who resisted faced enslavement or death. Yet the Prussians did not submit quietly. In 1260, a massive uprising engulfed nearly every conquered territory simultaneously. Prussian warriors, led by figures from the Natangian and Sambland nobility, besieged Teutonic fortresses and reclaimed vast stretches of land. For over a decade, the Great Prussian Uprising threatened to undo everything the order had built. Castles fell. Garrisons starved. The knights appealed desperately to the papacy and to Christian princes across Europe for reinforcements. Those reinforcements came. Fresh crusading armies arrived from the German lands, from Bohemia, from Austria. The order adapted its tactics, constructing even stronger fortifications and employing scorched earth campaigns that left entire Prussian regions depopulated. By 1274, the uprising's momentum had broken. The last significant resistance collapsed in the Sudovian wilderness by 1283, when the remaining free Prussian clans were either destroyed, scattered into Lithuanian forests, or absorbed into the order's colonial system. What replaced the old tribal world was something entirely new. The Teutonic state organized conquered Prussia into administrative districts called commanderies, each governed by a knight commander answerable to the Grand Master. German, Polish, and other settlers were invited to populate emptied lands, founding towns under Kulm law that granted specific municipal privileges. The Old Prussian language began its long decline as German became the language of law, commerce, and worship. Forced baptism erased the visible markers of pagan religion, though folk memories of sacred groves and ancestral spirits persisted in quiet corners for generations. The fortress at Marienburg, begun in 1274 on the Nogat River, grew steadily into the order's supreme headquarters. Its red brick walls rose above the marshlands like a monument to the merger of monastic devotion and military power. Within those walls, knight brothers followed a daily rhythm of prayer, administration, and martial training. They governed a territory stretching from the Vistula to the Niemen, a crusader state unlike any other in Christendom, built not in the distant Holy Land, but on Europe's own northeastern frontier. By 1283, the conquest was functionally complete. The old Prussians, as a sovereign people, had ceased to exist. Their name, however, survived, attached now to the very land their conquerors ruled. It was a final, quiet irony. The Teutonic Order had destroyed a civilization and inherited its name, carrying it forward into centuries the original Prussians would never see. The land they ruled stretched across a vast arc of Baltic coastline, from the lower Vistula eastward beyond the Pregel to the shores of the Curonian Lagoon. By the close of the 13th century, the Teutonic Order governed this territory not as a temporary military occupation, but as a permanent theocratic state, one of the most unusual political entities medieval Europe ever produced. Monk warriors administered provinces, collected taxes, dispensed justice, and directed commerce, all while maintaining the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that theoretically governed their daily lives. The engine of this state was Malbuk. The castle complex on the Nogat River grew decade by decade into the largest brick structure in Europe, a sprawling fortress monastery whose red walls enclosed a grand master's palace, a chapter house, an infirmary, granaries, armories, and a church of soaring vaulted ceilings. Here the Grand Master presided over a governing council that dispatched orders to regional commanders across the territory. Administration was methodical. The order maintained written records of harvests, trade revenues, military inventories, and diplomatic correspondence with a precision unusual for the age. Commerce transformed the Crusader state into something far wealthier than a mere military outpost. The order controlled the amber trade, harvesting the golden resin from Baltic beaches and selling it across Europe for rosaries, jewelry, and decorative arts. Grain from the fertile Vistula lowlands flowed through Danzig and Elbing into Hanseatic trading networks that connected the Baltic to Flanders, England, and the Mediterranean. The order itself became a merchant power, operating its own fleet, negotiating trade privileges, and accumulating revenues that funded castle construction and military campaigns on a scale few secular lords could match. Towns grew under the order's charter system. Thorn, Kulm, Königsberg, and Braunsberg received municipal rights modeled on German urban law, attracting settlers from Saxony, Thuringia, Silesia, and beyond. German-speaking colonists filled these towns as merchants, craftsmen, and farmers, while the surviving native Prussian population occupied a subordinate position, gradually assimilating into the lower strata of a society shaped by Germanic language and custom. The countryside was divided into estates worked by both free settlers and unfree laborers, producing the surplus that sustained the order's military apparatus. Yet the very success of the Crusader state created the conditions for its crisis. Lithuania, the last pagan realm in Europe, accepted Christian baptism in 1386 through the marriage of Grand Duke Jogaila to the Polish Queen Jadwiga. This conversion eliminated the order's stated reason for existence. A crusading state without pagans to convert became an anachronism, and its neighbors recognized the vulnerability. Poland and Lithuania, now dynastically united, challenged Teutonic territorial ambitions with growing confidence. The collision came on the 15th of July, 1410, on fields between the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg. A combined Polish-Lithuanian army, reinforced by Bohemian, Ruthenian, and Tatar contingents, met the full strength of the Teutonic Order in one of the largest battles medieval Europe had witnessed. The fighting was savage and prolonged. By afternoon, the order's lines had broken. The Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, lay dead on the field alongside much of the senior leadership. Hundreds of knight brothers perished. The army that had seemed invincible for a century was shattered in a single day. Malbec's walls held against the subsequent siege, and the order survived as a political entity. But the aura of invincibility was gone forever. The financial burden of ransoming captured knights and rebuilding military strength drained the treasury. Towns that had prospered under Teutonic rule began resenting the order's commercial monopolies and authoritarian governance. The seeds of internal rebellion joined the external military humiliation, setting in motion a long decline that would eventually strip the order of its sovereignty entirely and open the door to a transformation no crusading brother could have foreseen. That transformation began not with a single dramatic rupture, but with a slow, grinding erosion of everything the Teutonic Order had built across 2 centuries of crusading authority. The decades following Grunwald saw the Order trapped between external enemies, growing bolder, and internal subjects growing restless. Poland and Lithuania, united under the Jagiellonian dynasty, pressed their advantage relentlessly. The Treaty of Thorn in 1411 imposed heavy indemnities that the order could barely afford, and though the knights retained their territorial core, the financial hemorrhage never truly stopped. Within the order's own lands, the cities and lesser nobility who had once accepted Teutonic governance as a guarantor of stability now chafed under its weight. Merchants in Danzig, Thorn, and Elbing resented trade restrictions that enriched the order at their expense. The Prussian Confederation, formed in 1440, united these discontented towns and landholders into an organized opposition that petitioned the Polish crown for protection. When diplomacy failed, open revolt erupted. The 13 Years' War, lasting from 1454 to 1466, devastated the order's remaining strength. Mercenary armies hired by both sides ravaged the countryside. Castles changed hands repeatedly. The order, unable to pay its own soldiers, watched fortresses fall not to siege, but to mutiny. The Second Treaty of Thorn in 1466 redrew the map entirely. The western half of the order's territory, including Malbec itself, passed directly to the Polish crown as Royal Prussia. The eastern remnant survived as a diminished Teutonic state, but now held as a fief under Polish suzerainty. The Grand Master relocated to Königsberg, ruling a truncated domain that bore little resemblance to the vast Crusader realm of the previous century. The order's spiritual mission had long since hollowed out. No pagan peoples remained to convert. The knights governed as secular landlords draped in religious vestments that convinced no one. Into this twilight stepped Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, elected Grand Master in 1510. A member of the Hohenzollern family, Albert possessed dynastic ambitions that the decaying order could never satisfy. He sought allies, reformed administration, and attempted military resistance against Polish overlordship, but every effort met frustration. Then the Reformation arrived and offered something unprecedented, a way out. Martin Luther's challenge to Rome had shattered the religious unity of Latin Christendom. Albert met Luther personally in 1523 and found in Protestant theology not merely spiritual conviction, but political opportunity. A monastic military order made no sense in a world where reformers denied the spiritual value of religious vows. Luther reportedly advised Albert to dissolve the order, marry, and establish a hereditary duchy. The logic was devastating in its simplicity. In 1525, Albert knelt before the Polish king in Krakow and performed the Prussian homage. He renounced his position as Grand Master, accepted the Eastern Territory as a hereditary secular duchy under Polish sovereignty, and became Duke Albert of Prussia. The white cloaks and black crosses vanished from Königsberg's halls. Lutheran churches replaced Catholic chapels. The first Protestant university in the world opened in Königsberg in 1544, a center of learning that would shape Baltic intellectual life for centuries. The transformation was breathtaking in its completeness. A crusader state founded on holy war and monastic discipline became a Protestant duchy governed by a married prince with hereditary succession. The Teutonic Order survived elsewhere in diminished form, but in Prussia its story was finished. What remained was a small, vulnerable duchy on the Baltic periphery, bound to Poland by feudal obligation, governed by Hohenzollerns, whose family also ruled the electorate of Brandenburg far to the west. No one in 1525 could have predicted that this dynastic connection between a modest duchy and a middling electorate would eventually produce one of Europe's most formidable states. The seed was planted in the soil of a dissolved crusading order, watered by Protestant conviction and Hohenzollern ambition, waiting for the century ahead to reveal what it might become. That seed lay dormant for decades, fragile and seemingly insignificant. Ducal Prussia under Hohenzollern rule remained a minor Baltic territory, its duke a vassal of the Polish crown, its economy dependent on grain exports and amber, its population sparse and its military negligible. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the west, the electorate of Brandenburg occupied the sandy plains around Berlin, a territory of modest wealth and limited influence within the sprawling patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire. These two Hohenzollern possessions shared a dynasty but little else. Different legal traditions governed them. Different overlords claimed authority over them. Brandenburg answered to the emperor in Vienna. Prussia owed homage to the king in Krakow. No natural geography connected them, and a wide belt of Polish territory separated their borders entirely. Yet dynastic logic operated with its own quiet momentum. The Hohenzollern family tree branched and intertwined across generations, and in 1594, the marriage of Elector John Sigismund of Brandenburg to Anna of Prussia set in motion the decisive inheritance. When the last duke of the Prussian Hohenzollern line died without male heirs in 1618, John Sigismund claimed the duchy. In that same remarkable year, he also inherited territories along the Lower Rhine through another dynastic claim. Suddenly, the Elector of Brandenburg governed three disconnected clusters of land stretching from the Rhineland to the Baltic, separated by the territories of other princes, bishops, and the Polish crown. This was no empire. It was a logistical puzzle. Governing scattered possessions without contiguous borders demanded diplomatic skill merely to move officials and correspondence between them. The elector possessed no standing army of consequence, no centralized treasury, and no unified administration. Each territory retained its own estates, its own privileges, its own stubborn local nobility resistant to outside authority. Brandenburg's Junker landlords guarded their prerogatives fiercely. Prussian nobles expected their traditional freedoms. Rhenish subjects lived under entirely different legal customs. Then the catastrophe arrived. The 30 Years' War, which erupted in 1618 over religious and imperial rivalries, devastated Brandenburg with a thoroughness that defies easy description. Foreign armies crossed the electorate repeatedly. Swedish, Imperial, and Saxon forces treated it as a corridor and a larder, stripping villages of grain, livestock, and inhabitants. Brandenburg lost perhaps a third of its population to warfare, famine, and plague. Berlin itself was occupied and plundered. The Elector George William proved unable to protect his subjects, vacillating between alliances, lacking the military strength to enforce neutrality or resist invasion. His territories in the west suffered similarly, caught between Spanish and Dutch forces contesting the Rhine. The war revealed the fatal weakness of the Hohenzollern inheritance. Scattered lands without a strong army meant vulnerability from every direction. No single territory could defend the others. No unified command existed to coordinate resistance. The estates in each province controlled taxation and resisted any attempt to fund permanent military forces. Brandenburg emerged from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 with modest territorial gains in Pomerania and several secularized bishoprics. But these additions only deepened the fundamental problem of disconnection. Yet the war also created the conditions for transformation. Devastated populations could not resist centralization as effectively as prosperous ones. The manifest failure of weak government discredited the old decentralized order. When Frederick William inherited the electorate in 1640 at the age of 20, he found a ruined land and a scattered inheritance that demanded either radical reform or permanent irrelevance. The Hohenzollern territories had survived the worst war Europe had yet known, but survival alone guaranteed nothing. What mattered now was whether a young ruler could forge something coherent from these broken, disconnected pieces, something strong enough to ensure that such devastation could never be inflicted so easily again. Frederick William moved quickly because he had no choice. The young elector arrived in Berlin in 1640 to find his territories stripped bare, his treasury empty, his small army unpaid and unreliable, and his nominal sovereignty mocked by Swedish garrisons occupying Pomeranian fortresses that rightfully belonged to Brandenburg. The 30 Years' War still raged for 8 more years, and the elector possessed almost nothing with which to fight it. His first act was not military but diplomatic. He negotiated a truce with Sweden, buying time with concessions that cost him pride, but preserved what remained. From this humiliation, Frederick William drew a lesson that would define his entire reign and reshape the Hohenzollern state forever. Power required soldiers, soldiers required money, and money required a taxation system that no provincial diet could obstruct at will. The old arrangement, in which each territory's estates controlled their own purse strings and granted revenues only when they chose, had left Brandenburg defenseless. The elector set about dismantling this arrangement with patience, pressure, and occasional force. In Brandenburg itself, he extracted a permanent military tax from the estates by 1653, breaking the principle that revenues required fresh consent each year. In ducal Prussia, where the Junker nobility resisted most fiercely, he crushed opposition through a combination of military intimidation and selective concession, confirming noble privileges over their peasants in exchange for accepting permanent taxation. In Cleves and Mark along the Rhine, he imposed similar arrangements. Territory by territory, the elector constructed a fiscal architecture that fed a single central purpose: the standing army. That army grew from fewer than 3,000 men at his accession to nearly 30,000 by the 1680s. Frederick William built not merely a larger force, but a professional one, drilled in Dutch and Swedish methods, supplied through centralized commissariats, and commanded by officers who answered to Berlin rather than to local magnates. The General War Commissariat became the institutional spine of the new state, collecting taxes, provisioning garrisons, and extending the elector's authority into corners of his territories where ducal writ had previously meant little. The canal connecting the Spree and Oder rivers, completed in 1669, symbolized this centralizing vision. It linked Berlin to Baltic trade routes, generating customs revenue while binding the elector's scattered lands through commerce. Frederick William welcomed Huguenot refugees expelled from France after 1685, settling nearly 20,000 skilled Protestants in Brandenburg, enriching Berlin's economy and cultural life in a single stroke of calculated tolerance. Yet the moment that transformed reputation into legend came at Fehrbellin in June of 1675. Swedish forces had invaded Brandenburg, while Frederick William campaigned along the Rhine with his imperial allies. Racing his cavalry across hundreds of miles in a forced march that stunned contemporaries, the Elector intercepted the Swedes near the village of Fehrbellin and routed them in a sharp engagement. The battle was modest in scale, but enormous in consequence. Brandenburg had defeated Sweden, the dominant Baltic military power, on open ground. European courts took notice. The Elector earned the title the Great Elector, and his state earned something more valuable than any title: the recognition that this scattered collection of provinces possessed a military will disproportionate to its size. When Frederick William died in 1688, he left his son an army, a bureaucracy, a treasury, and a principle. The state existed to maintain the army, and the army existed to guarantee the state. Every institution he built served this circular logic. He had not created a great power, not yet. Brandenburg Prussia remained poor, underpopulated, and geographically vulnerable. But he had created something perhaps more important, a machine capable of becoming one, a framework of discipline and extraction that future Hohenzollerns would expand with extraordinary consequences. The ashes of the 30 Years' War had been forged into something cold, functional, and enduring. The son who inherited that machine understood its power, but craved something it could not yet provide: prestige. Frederick III of Brandenburg, who came to power upon his father's death in 1688, possessed neither the great elector's military instincts nor his ruthless pragmatism. He was slight, physically deformed by a childhood accident that left one shoulder higher than the other, and drawn not to barracks, but to ceremony, architecture, and the glittering rituals of European court life. His critics, and there would be many, dismissed him as vain. But Frederick harbored an ambition that would prove transformative. He wanted a crown. The desire was not mere vanity. In the intricate hierarchy of European sovereignty, an elector ranked below a king. Brandenburg Prussia's scattered territories commanded respect through military capacity, but at diplomatic tables, Frederick sat beneath the monarchs of Denmark, Poland, and Sweden. The distinction mattered enormously in an age when protocol determined alliance, marriage, and territorial negotiation. A royal title would elevate the Hohenzollern house permanently, placing it among Europe's ruling dynasties rather than beneath them. The obstacle was the Holy Roman Emperor. Only the emperor could sanction a new royal title within the empire's complex constitutional framework, and Emperor Leopold I in Vienna had little reason to create a rival. Frederick spent years cultivating the opportunity, and it arrived through war. When the Spanish succession crisis threatened to engulf Europe in 1699, Leopold desperately needed military allies. Frederick offered 8,000 Prussian troops for the coming conflict. In exchange, he demanded recognition as king in Prussia, carefully choosing the formulation to avoid offending Polish sensitivities over sovereignty in the region. The coronation took place on January 18, 1701, in Königsberg, the old ducal capital far to the east. Frederick deliberately staged the ceremony outside imperial territory to emphasize that his kingship derived from his own sovereign authority in Prussia, not from imperial grant. He placed the crown upon his own head, a gesture of self-made sovereignty that would echo through later European coronations. The celebrations lasted for days, consuming vast sums that Brandenburg Prussia could scarcely afford. As Frederick I of Prussia, the new king threw himself into reshaping his capital. Berlin and its twin city Köln underwent dramatic transformation. The architect Andreas Schlüter redesigned the royal palace in monumental Baroque style. Charlottenburg Palace rose on the western outskirts, an elegant summer residence named for Frederick's beloved wife, Sophie Charlotte, whose intellectual salon attracted philosophers including Leibniz. The Berlin Academy of Sciences, founded in 1700 at Sophie Charlotte's urging, gave the kingdom scholarly credentials to match its military ones. The court grew lavish. French was spoken in polished halls. Tapestries, silver services, and elaborate ceremonial dress consumed revenues that the great elector had carefully hoarded for military purposes. Frederick maintained the army his father built, but invested little in expanding it. The bureaucratic machinery continued functioning through institutional momentum rather than royal attention. Provincial administrators collected taxes, maintained roads, and enforced order while the king attended operas and planned architectural commissions. This tension between display and discipline defined the reign. Frederick understood that European recognition required cultural sophistication, that a kingdom of soldiers alone would never command the respect he sought. Yet the extravagance strained a treasury built for austerity. By the time Frederick died in February 1713, the state's finances were deeply compromised, the army relatively neglected, and the court encrusted with expensive ceremony. His legacy was the title itself. The word king, once secured, could never be revoked. It gave every future Hohenzollern a standing that no elector could claim, a seat at the highest table of European politics. The Baroque palaces and academies gave Berlin the beginnings of a cultural identity beyond garrison life. And the very excess of Frederick's reign provoked a reaction so severe that it would reshape Prussia more profoundly than any war. His son, already watching from the shadows with undisguised contempt for every silk curtain and gilded candlestick, would strip the kingdom back to bare iron. Frederick William I ascended the throne and immediately began dismantling his father's world. Within weeks of taking power in 1713, he dismissed most of the court musicians, sold the royal silver, auctioned off his father's prized horses, and slashed the household budget to a fraction of its former size. Courtiers who had flourished under Baroque extravagance found themselves without positions. The transformation was not gradual. It was violent, deliberate, and total. The new king despised everything ornamental. Where his father had draped rooms in velvet, Frederick William preferred whitewashed walls and plain wooden furniture. Where the old court had staged elaborate operas, the new one gathered around a smoking table where the king and his officers drank cheap beer and discussed military affairs. This was the Tabax Collegium, the tobacco parliament, and it became the informal center of Prussian governance. No protocol, no wigs, no ceremony beyond the passing of clay pipes. What replaced luxury was discipline of an almost pathological intensity. Frederick William poured every thaler saved from court reductions into the army. He inherited a force of roughly 38,000 men and expanded it to over 80,000, making Prussia's military the fourth largest in Europe, despite the kingdom ranking only 13th in population and 10th in territory. The disproportion was staggering and intentional. The army was not merely an instrument of policy. It was the state's reason for existence. The king personally supervised drilling on the parade grounds of Potsdam, striking officers with his cane when formations wavered. He introduced the canton system, dividing the kingdom into recruitment districts that tied each regiment to a specific region, binding military service to the land itself. Prussian boys were enrolled on regimental lists from birth. The system created a permanent reservoir of trained men who could be called from their farms and workshops when war demanded. His most famous obsession was the Potsdam Giants, officially the Grand Grenadiers of Potsdam, a regiment composed entirely of extraordinarily tall soldiers recruited or purchased from across Europe. Agents scoured the continent for men above 6 feet, sometimes kidnapping them. The regiment served little practical military purpose, but embodied the king's fixation on physical perfection and absolute control over human material. Beyond the army, Frederick William constructed a bureaucratic apparatus of remarkable efficiency. The General Directory, established in 1723, centralized financial and administrative authority under direct royal supervision. Tax collection became systematic. Provincial officials answered to Berlin through chains of written reports, inspections, and audits. Corruption was punished with public humiliation and imprisonment. The king read reports personally, scrawling furious marginalia on documents that displeased him. Education received attention not from enlightened idealism, but from practical calculation. A literate population produced better soldiers and more productive taxpayers. Compulsory schooling edicts, though unevenly enforced, established the principle that every Prussian child owed the state a basic education. The Junker aristocracy was simultaneously disciplined and elevated. Noble families were expected to send their sons into the officer corps, transforming a landed class into a service caste bound to the crown by duty and career rather than feudal sentiment alone. The king's personal cruelty extended into his own household. His eldest son, the future Frederick II, suffered relentless abuse for his love of French literature, music, and philosophy. The prince's attempted escape in 1730 led to his imprisonment and the execution of his closest companion before his eyes. The episode revealed the terrifying logic of the system. Even royal blood could not exempt a man from obedience. Frederick William fought almost no wars. His single significant military engagement, a brief intervention in the Great Northern War, gained him Stettin and a strip of western Pomerania. The restraint was strategic. He built the instrument but refused to risk it, hoarding soldiers and treasury reserves with equal obsession. When he died in 1740, He left his successor a full war chest of 8 million thalers and an army trained to mechanical precision, a coiled spring awaiting release. The son who had been beaten for reading Voltaire would use that inheritance to shake Europe to its foundations. Frederick II ascended the throne in May of 1740, and within 6 months he had plunged Europe into war. The young king, who loved French poetry and played the transverse flute with genuine artistry, made his decision with cold, mathematical precision. In October, the Habsburg Emperor Charles VI died without a male heir, leaving his daughter Maria Theresa to claim a contested inheritance. Frederick saw not a diplomatic crisis, but an opportunity that might never return. Silesia, the wealthy Habsburg province stretching along the Oder River into the Sudeten Mountains, possessed fertile farmland, thriving linen manufactures, and a population exceeding 1 million. Its acquisition would transform Prussia from a middling kingdom into a genuine European power. He gave no warning. In December of 1740, Prussian columns crossed the Silesian frontier without a declaration of war, advancing through light snowfall into territory whose Austrian garrisons were scattered and undermanned. The speed stunned European courts. Frederick justified the invasion with ancient Hohenzollern claims to Silesian duchies, legal arguments so tenuous that even his own ministers found them unconvincing. The real justification was simpler. His father had left him the army, the treasury, and the will to use both. The first serious test came at Mollwitz in April of 1741. Prussian infantry, drilled to the mechanical perfection Frederick William had demanded, delivered volleys at a rate Austrian troops could not match. Yet the battle nearly ended in disaster. Austrian cavalry shattered the Prussian horse on the right flank, and Frederick himself fled the field on advisers' urging, believing the day lost. His infantry commander Schwerin rallied the foot soldiers, whose relentless musketry ground the Austrian lines into retreat. Frederick learned a lesson he never forgot. Prussian infantry could win battles that Prussian cavalry and Prussian kings could not. The First Silesian War settled into negotiation as France, Bavaria, and Saxony piled onto the Habsburg succession crisis for their own gains. Frederick exploited the wider conflict ruthlessly, fighting when advantageous and negotiating when threatened. The Treaty of Breslau in 1742 ceded most of Silesia to Prussia, and Maria Theresa accepted the loss only because she faced enemies on every frontier simultaneously. The peace lasted barely 2 years. By 1744, Austria had recovered sufficiently to alarm Frederick, who feared a coalition would eventually form to reclaim the lost province. He struck again, launching the Second Silesian War with an invasion of Bohemia that initially succeeded but soon faltered against stiffening Austrian resistance and overstretched supply lines. The campaign of 1745 proved far harder than the First War. At Hohenfriedberg in June, Frederick personally commanded a dawn attack that caught the combined Austrian and Saxon army unprepared, shattering their formations in a battle that became legendary in Prussian military memory. At Sur in September, outnumbered and nearly surrounded, Prussian discipline again turned potential catastrophe into victory. The Treaty of Dresden in December of 1745 confirmed Prussian possession of Silesia for a second time. Frederick had gambled everything on the quality of his inherited army and the weakness of his neighbors, and he had won. Prussia now controlled a province whose tax revenues and population dramatically expanded the kingdom's resources. Berlin celebrated, but the cost was real. Thousands of Prussian soldiers lay buried across Bohemian and Silesian fields, and the treasury his father had so carefully accumulated was severely depleted. More dangerous still was the hatred Frederick had earned. Maria Theresa never accepted the loss of Silesia as permanent. She began rebuilding Austrian military power, reforming her administration, and cultivating alliances with a single consuming purpose: the recovery of her stolen province. Russia watched Prussia's sudden rise with growing suspicion. France, initially Frederick's ally, grew wary of a partner whose loyalty lasted only as long as convenience. Across the courts of Europe, diplomats began the quiet conversations that would eventually produce the most formidable coalition the continent had seen in generations, all aimed at one target. Frederick had made Prussia a power. Now he would have to survive the consequences. The coalition that formed against Prussia between 1749 and 1756 represented a diplomatic revolution without precedent in modern European history. Austria, which had fought France for 2 centuries, now embraced it as an ally. Russia, whose vast armies had barely touched Western European affairs, committed to Prussia's destruction. Saxony, Sweden, and the German Imperial Diet joined the encirclement. Against this array of powers commanding populations exceeding 100 million, Frederick ruled a kingdom of barely 4.5 million souls. He struck first. In August of 1756, Prussian columns invaded Saxony without declaration of war, seizing its treasury and forcibly incorporating its army. The gamble was characteristic, speed and aggression compensating for weakness in depth. But this time, the strategy that had worked in Silesia produced diminishing returns. The Saxon campaign consumed months. Austrian forces mobilized. By 1757, Frederick faced converging armies from every direction. What followed was the most extraordinary military performance of the 18th century, and simultaneously its most harrowing. At Rossbach in November of 1757, Frederick shattered a combined Franco-Imperial army nearly twice his size in barely 90 minutes, his cavalry sweeping around the Allied flank with devastating precision. Weeks later at Leuthen, he destroyed an Austrian force of 80,000 with oblique attack formations that military theorists would study for generations. These victories electrified Protestant Europe and secured British financial subsidies that kept the Prussian war machine functioning. Yet brilliance on the battlefield could not overcome arithmetic. For every army Frederick defeated, another materialized. Russian forces entered East Prussia and occupied Königsberg. Austrian armies recaptured much of Silesia. Swedish troops raided Pomerania. The Prussian heartland of Brandenburg itself suffered enemy occupation. At Kunersdorf in August of 1759, a combined Russo-Austrian force annihilated Frederick's army so completely that he briefly contemplated suicide. Nearly 20,000 Prussian soldiers fell in a single afternoon. The kingdom began consuming itself. Regiments filled their ranks with prisoners of war, deserters recaptured and forced back into service, adolescents, old men. Prussian villages emptied of working-age males. Harvests rotted in fields where no laborers remained to gather them. The legendary treasury that Frederick William I had accumulated vanished into powder smoke and mercenary wages. Provinces that had taken decades to develop were stripped of livestock, grain, and timber by occupying armies that distinguished little between enemy territory and Allied ground. Frederick aged visibly. The elegant prince who had played flute at Sanssouci became a gaunt, stooped figure in a threadbare uniform, sleeping on campaign cots, surviving on coffee and will. His letters from these years reveal a mind oscillating between cold strategic calculation and profound despair. He carried poison with him, resolved never to be taken alive. Salvation came not from Prussian arms, but from Russian mortality. In January of 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died. Her successor, Peter III, idolized Frederick and immediately withdrew Russia from the war, returning all conquered territories. This miraculous deliverance, which Frederick himself called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, shattered the coalition's cohesion. France, exhausted by colonial losses to Britain, sought peace. Austria, unable to fight alone, accepted the restoration of the pre-war territorial settlement at the Treaty of Hubertusburg in February of 1763. Prussia retained Silesia. That single fact, purchased with 7 years of carnage, confirmed the kingdom's status among Europe's great powers. But the cost defied calculation. Entire districts lay depopulated. Saxony, occupied throughout the war, harbored generational hatred. Perhaps 500,000 Prussian subjects had perished from combat, famine, and disease in a kingdom that could scarcely afford to lose a fraction of that number. Frederick returned to a devastated realm and began rebuilding with the same relentless discipline that had sustained the war. He distributed grain, horses, and seed to ruined provinces. He settled immigrants on abandoned lands. He rebuilt shattered towns with state funds and royal decree. The machinery of Prussian administration, battered but unbroken, ground forward. What emerged from the 7 Years' War was not merely a kingdom that had survived, but a legend, the small state that had defied a continent and endured. That legend would prove as consequential as any battle, shaping how Prussians understood themselves and how Europe understood the dangerous, disciplined power growing on the North German plain. The king who returned from 7 years of continental war was no longer the ambitious young prince who had seized Silesia. Frederick was 51, gaunt, stooped, his teeth failing, his health broken by years of camp life and relentless anxiety. Yet the mind remained ferocious, and the decades that followed the Peace of Hubertusburg would reveal a ruler determined to reshape his kingdom through law, administration, and intellectual rigor, as thoroughly as he had defended it through war. Sanssouci became the center of this transformation. The intimate palace outside Potsdam, with its terraced vineyards and rococo chambers, functioned less as a royal residence than as a working laboratory of governance and philosophy. Frederick rose before dawn, reviewed dispatches, composed memoranda on legal reform, corresponded with philosophers across Europe, and practiced his flute in the evening hours. He had hosted Voltaire years earlier, and though that friendship had ended in bitter recrimination, the king continued to write in French, to read voraciously, and to regard himself as the first servant of the state rather than its master. The legal reforms came first. Frederick commissioned a comprehensive revision of Prussian law, seeking to replace the patchwork of feudal customs, provincial codes, and arbitrary judicial practices with a rational, unified system. The project would not be completed until after his death, emerging as the general state laws for the Prussian states in 1794, but the principles Frederick established shaped its foundation. Torture was largely abolished. Judicial proceedings were streamlined. The king insisted that courts operate independently of royal interference in civil cases, a remarkable position for an absolute monarch, though he reserved the right to intervene when he judged justice miscarried. Religious tolerance became a defining feature of the reign. Frederick welcomed Catholics, Huguenots, and Jews into Prussian territories, declaring that all religions must be tolerated and that every man must find salvation in his own fashion. Jesuits expelled from other Catholic lands found refuge in Prussian Silesia. This tolerance was pragmatic as much as philosophical. A kingdom devastated by war needed settlers, artisans, and merchants regardless of their faith. Agricultural improvement consumed enormous royal attention. Frederick drained marshlands along the Oder and Wartha rivers, creating thousands of acres of farmable land. He introduced the potato as a staple crop, overcoming peasant resistance through a combination of royal decree and practical demonstration. He settled colonists on reclaimed land, offering tax exemptions and building materials. Silesian weavers received state support. New villages rose from drained bogs. Yet the contradictions ran deep. The king who championed reason and tolerance preserved serfdom across his eastern territories. Junker landlords retained their feudal authority over peasant labor. Frederick regarded the aristocracy as essential to his military system and refused to dismantle the social order that supplied his officer corps. Universal education advanced under his reign, with village schools spreading across the kingdom, but the curriculum served state purposes, producing obedient subjects and literate soldiers rather than free thinkers. The bureaucracy grew more precise, more demanding, more intrusive. Royal inspectors monitored grain supplies, road conditions, tax collection, and school attendance. Provincial chambers reported directly to the king, who personally reviewed an astonishing volume of administrative detail. No decision was too small for royal attention. Frederick micromanaged his kingdom with the same intensity he had once directed cavalry charges. In his final years, the king grew increasingly isolated. He preferred the company of his Italian greyhounds to most humans. He dressed in a threadbare uniform stained with snuff. Foreign visitors found him sharp, cynical, and exhausting. Yet the kingdom he governed functioned with remarkable efficiency. When Frederick died at Sanssouci in August of 1786, he left behind a state that had doubled its territory, tripled its revenue, and established itself as a European power of the first rank. He also left behind an unresolved paradox that would haunt Prussia for generations. A state built on obedience that celebrated reason, an enlightened despotism that could not survive without the despot. The paradox Frederick left behind was not merely philosophical. It was embedded in the very soil of Brandenburg and Pomerania, in the rye fields and sandy estates east of the Elbe, where a class of minor nobles had shaped Prussian identity as profoundly as any king. The Junkers were not grand aristocrats in the French or English sense. They possessed no glittering chateau, no vast inherited wealth, no tradition of courtly refinement. Their manor houses were often modest structures of timber and brick, surrounded by barns, granaries, and the low cottages of the peasants who worked their land. What they possessed instead was something more consequential, an unbroken compact with the Hohenzollern crown that traded political submission for social dominance. This compact had crystallized across the 17th and 18th centuries. The great elector had stripped the Junkers of their parliamentary resistance, but confirmed their authority over the peasantry. Frederick William I had demanded their sons fill his officer corps, but guaranteed their estates remained intact and their serfs remained bound. Frederick the Great had refined this arrangement into a system of mutual dependence so thorough that neither crown nor nobility could function without the other. The Junker provided officers, the crown provided purpose, and the peasant provided everything else. Life on a Junker estate followed rhythms older than the Prussian state itself. The agricultural year dictated existence: spring ploughing, summer harvest, autumn slaughter, winter repair. The estate owner managed his domain with the same methodical attention a Prussian officer applied to his regiment. Account books recorded every bushel of grain, every head of livestock, every labor obligation owed by dependent families. Peasants on eastern estates remained bound to the land through forms of serfdom that Western German territories had largely abandoned. They owed days of unpaid labor each week, surrendered portions of their harvest, and required the lord's permission to marry or leave. The manor house itself served as courthouse, administrative center, and social anchor. The Junker settled disputes among his tenants, collected taxes on behalf of the crown, and maintained local order with an authority that was simultaneously feudal and bureaucratic. His wife managed the household economy with similar precision, overseeing dairy production, linen weaving, and the preservation of food stores that sustained the estate through long Baltic winters. Yet the defining feature of Junker identity was not agricultural management, but military service. From adolescence, sons of the nobility entered cadet schools where Prussian discipline was instilled through relentless drill, physical hardship, and an ethic of obedience that bordered on the sacred. The officer's commission was not merely a career, but a social sacrament. It confirmed noble status, guaranteed modest income, and provided entry into the only institution that truly mattered in Prussian public life. Regiments became extended families. Officers served together for decades, married within the same social circles, and retired to neighboring estates where they replicated military hierarchy in civilian life. This world produced a distinctive human type: austere, dutiful, suspicious of luxury, contemptuous of commerce, fiercely loyal to the crown, yet jealous of local prerogative. The Junker officer regarded himself as the backbone of the state, and Frederick's Prussia largely confirmed this self-image. The bureaucracy recruited from the same families. The church deferred to their patronage. The universities educated their sons in law and administration before military service claimed them. The system's efficiency was genuine. Prussian estates were better managed than many European counterparts. Prussian officers were more professional than most continental rivals. Prussian administration functioned with a regularity that astonished foreign observers. But the cost was borne invisibly by those at the bottom. The peasant who fed the system had no voice within it. The serf who labored on Junker fields had no legal path to independence. The entire structure rested on a hierarchy so internalized that questioning it seemed not rebellious, but incomprehensible. When Frederick died, this world stood at its zenith. The Junker class had never been more secure, more integrated into state machinery, more confident in its purpose. No one standing in those rye fields in 1786 could have imagined that within 20 years a French emperor would shatter the entire edifice, forcing Prussia to choose between transformation and extinction. Frederick William II, who inherited the throne in 1786, was everything his uncle had not been. Where Frederick the Great had been ascetic, disciplined, and relentlessly focused on statecraft, his nephew was indulgent, mystical, and easily swayed by favorites. The new king maintained mistresses openly, dabbled in Rosicrucian occultism, and allowed the bureaucratic machinery his predecessors had built to drift without firm direction. Prussia's army remained large, its administration still functioned, but the animating will at the center had gone slack. The kingdom coasted on institutional momentum through the revolutionary wars of the 1790s, acquiring Polish territory in the partitions while avoiding decisive confrontation with revolutionary France. When Frederick William III succeeded his father in 1797, the situation demanded boldness. Instead, the new king offered hesitation. He was decent, conscientious, and utterly incapable of decisive action. While Napoleon remade the map of Europe, Prussia clung to neutrality, watching Austria and Russia absorb catastrophic defeats at Austerlitz in 1805 without committing to either side. Prussian generals aged in their commands, still drilling formations perfected under Frederick the Great, convinced that the army of Rossbach and Leuthen remained invincible. The illusion shattered in a single afternoon. On the 14th of October, 1806, Napoleon's forces met the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. The result was not merely defeat, but annihilation. At Jena, Napoleon overwhelmed a Prussian force still maneuvering in rigid 18th-century formations. At Auerstedt, a single French corps under Davout destroyed the main Prussian army commanded by the Duke of Brunswick, who fell mortally wounded. Within hours, the military machine that had taken a century to build ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. What followed was collapse on a scale that stunned Europe. Fortress commanders surrendered without firing a shot. Entire garrisons capitulated to French cavalry detachments a fraction of their size. The rot that decades of complacency had bred now revealed itself in officers who had inherited their positions and soldiers drilled in obedience, but not initiative. Napoleon entered Berlin on the 27th of October, riding through the Brandenburg Gate while the Prussian court fled eastward toward Königsberg in desperate humiliation. The French emperor imposed terms designed to reduce Prussia to insignificance. At Tilsit in July of 1807, Frederick William III stood on a raft in the Niemen River, while Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I negotiated the future of Europe between themselves. Prussia lost nearly half its territory and population. The lands west of the Elbe were stripped away entirely. A massive war indemnity was imposed. French garrisons occupied key fortresses, and the army was limited to 42,000 men. The kingdom that had terrified Europe under Frederick the Great was reduced to a middling North German state, surviving on Napoleon's sufferance. The humiliation cut deeper than territorial loss. It revealed that the entire Frederiциan system, the rigid social hierarchy, the unquestioning military obedience, the Junker officer corps frozen in inherited privilege, had become a magnificent anachronism. The French army that destroyed Prussia at Jena was composed of citizens motivated by revolutionary ideals and led by officers promoted on merit. Prussia's army was led by elderly aristocrats commanding peasant conscripts who fought because they were told to fight. The contrast was devastating and undeniable. In the shattered remnants of the old order, something extraordinary began to stir. Even as French troops patrolled Prussian streets and Napoleon's administrators extracted wealth from occupied provinces, a small circle of reformers recognized that survival required not restoration, but reinvention. The catastrophe of 1806, total and unmistakable, created the one condition that Prussia's rigid system could never have produced from within: the absolute necessity of fundamental change. The men who stepped forward to remake Prussia in the aftermath of total defeat were not revolutionaries. They were servants of the crown who understood that the crown itself would perish unless the state beneath it was rebuilt from its foundations. Baron Heinrich Friedrich Karl vom und zum Stein, recalled from dismissal to serve as chief minister in October of 1807, possessed a temperament as fierce as the crisis demanded. His first great act, the Edict of Emancipation issued from Memel that same month, struck at the feudal order that had defined Prussian society for centuries. Hereditary serfdom was abolished. Peasants could now own land, choose occupations, and move freely. The rigid caste system that had bound noble, burgher, and peasant into separate legal worlds began to dissolve on paper, though its dissolution in practice would take decades of painful adjustment. Stein's vision extended beyond agrarian reform. He reorganized the central government into functional ministries modeled on rational principles rather than aristocratic privilege. Municipal self-government, introduced through the City Ordinance of 1808, gave urban citizens direct responsibility for local administration. The intention was to awaken civic participation in a population long trained to obey without thinking. Napoleon, recognizing the danger of a reformer who sought to mobilize Prussian society against French domination, forced Stein's dismissal in November of 1808. Karl August von Hardenberg continued the work with a diplomat's patience where Stein had brought a prophet's fury. The military reforms proved equally radical. Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August Neidhart von Gneisenau dismantled the old army's aristocratic exclusivity. Officer commissions would now be earned through education and merit rather than birth alone. Corporal punishment was curtailed. The degrading punishments that had driven soldiers through fear were replaced by appeals to honor and patriotic duty. Most critically, the reformers introduced the Krimper system, a method of cycling short-term conscripts through limited training periods to build a hidden reserve force far larger than the treaty with Napoleon permitted. Prussia was secretly preparing for a war of liberation while publicly submitting to French demands. Wilhelm von Humboldt's educational reforms completed the transformation. The University of Berlin, founded in 1810, embodied a new philosophy of learning that united research with teaching. Prussian schools would produce not merely obedient subjects, but thinking citizens capable of serving a modern state. The gymnasium system created rigorous secondary education that became a model across Europe. When Napoleon's catastrophic retreat from Moscow in 1812 shattered the myth of French invincibility, Prussia was ready. King Frederick William III, cautious to the point of paralysis, finally declared war in March of 1813. The reformed army that marched against France bore little resemblance to the force destroyed at Jena. Conscription now drew from all social classes. Officers led through competence. The General Staff system, Scharnhorst's greatest institutional innovation, coordinated operations with unprecedented efficiency. The campaigns of 1813 tested every reform. At Lützen and Bautzen, Prussian troops fought with determination that surprised even their allies. At the Battle of the Nations near Leipzig in October of 1813, the largest engagement in European history before the 20th century, Prussian forces formed a critical part of the coalition that shattered Napoleon's army. Over 3 days of carnage involving more than 500,000 soldiers, the French Empire's grip on Central Europe was broken. Prussian troops crossed the Rhine and fought their way into France itself. When Napoleon abdicated in April of 1814, and again after his final defeat at Waterloo in June of 1815, where Blucher's Prussian army arrived to rescue Wellington's exhausted forces, Prussia had earned its place among the victorious great powers. The Congress of Vienna rewarded Prussia with the Rhineland and Westphalia, territories that would transform the kingdom's economic future in ways no one yet imagined. The state that emerged from the furnace of defeat and reform was leaner, more efficient, and more dangerous than the old Prussia had ever been. Yet the tension between reform and reaction, between the promise of civic participation and the reality of monarchical authority, remained unresolved, a contradiction that would define Prussian politics for generations to come. The contradiction announced itself almost immediately. Frederick William III had promised his people a constitution during the desperate years of war against Napoleon, a pledge made when the crown needed every farmer and artisan to take up arms. Now, with victory secured and the Congress of Vienna redrawing the map of Europe, that promise dissolved into silence. The king who had wept at Tilsit and rallied his subjects at Breslau retreated into the cautious conservatism that Austrian Chancellor Metternich wove across the entire continent, like a net of silk and iron. The Vienna settlement had reshaped Prussia profoundly. The kingdom now stretched in 2 disconnected masses across northern Germany, its old eastern heartlands of Brandenburg, Pomerania, and East Prussia separated by Hanover and other states from the newly acquired Rhineland and Westphalia. These western territories were different in character from anything Prussia had governed before. The Rhineland was Catholic, commercially sophisticated, shaped by 2 decades of French legal codes and Napoleonic administration. Its merchants and manufacturers had tasted civic equality and rational governance. They did not easily submit to the paternalism of Junker officials dispatched from Berlin. Yet Metternich's system demanded exactly such submission. The Karlsbad decrees of 1819, prompted by the assassination of a conservative playwright by a radical student, imposed censorship across the German Confederation, dissolved student fraternities, and placed universities under surveillance. Prussia enforced these measures with characteristic thoroughness. Professors who spoke of constitutional government found themselves dismissed. Newspapers submitted to censors who struck out offending passages with black ink, leaving columns of visible silence on printed pages. The gymnastic societies that had trained young men for the wars of liberation were shut down as breeding grounds of dangerous nationalism. The irony was bitter. The very patriotic energy that had helped defeat Napoleon now threatened the restored order. Students who had marched to Leipzig singing songs of German unity gathered at the Wartburg Festival of 1817 to burn symbols of reaction and demand a united fatherland. Prussia's reformers, the intellectual heirs of Stein and Hardenberg, watched helplessly as their vision of a modernized constitutional monarchy was buried under layers of royal hesitation and Austrian pressure. Beneath this political stagnation, however, forces were stirring that no censor could suppress. The Zollverein, the customs union that Prussia began organizing in 1818 and formalized by 1834, quietly dismantled tariff barriers between German states. Goods flowed freely across borders that still divided sovereign kingdoms and duchies. Prussian economic policy accomplished what liberal politics could not, binding the German states together through shared commercial interest while deliberately excluding Austria. The Rhineland's coal deposits and iron foundries began feeding an industrial transformation that would alter the balance of power within a generation. Frederick William III died in 1840, and his son Frederick William IV ascended with romantic visions of a medieval Christian monarchy harmonized with popular affection. He relaxed censorship, freed political prisoners, and spoke warmly of German unity. But when revolution swept across Europe in 1848 and barricades rose in Berlin's streets that March, the king's romanticism collided with reality. He initially yielded, donning the black, red, and gold cockade of German nationalism, permitting a Prussian constituent assembly, and allowing the Frankfurt Parliament to attempt building a unified Germany through liberal deliberation. Then he recoiled. When the Frankfurt Assembly offered him the imperial crown of a united Germany in 1849, he refused it as a crown from the gutter, tainted by popular sovereignty rather than divine right. Prussian troops helped suppress revolutionary movements across Germany. The Constituent Assembly was dissolved. The old order reasserted itself with bayonets and bureaucratic efficiency. Yet something had changed irreversibly. The industrial Rhineland, the educated middle classes, the restless officer corps that dreamed of German greatness, none of these forces would remain quiet forever. Prussia had demonstrated that it possessed both the economic gravity and the military power to unite Germany. The only question was whether unification would come through parliaments or through something far more ruthless. The answer to that question was already being forged in the furnaces of the Ruhr Valley, hammered into shape on the anvils of Essen and Dortmund, and laid across the Brandenburg plains in ribbons of iron rail. The ruthlessness that would unite Germany was not merely political, it was industrial. In the 1830s, Prussia remained an overwhelmingly agricultural kingdom. Junker estates still dominated the eastern provinces. Peasants still worked fields that had been tilled for centuries, and Berlin, though growing, could not rival London or Paris as a center of manufacturing. Yet beneath the surface of this conservative order, transformative forces were gathering momentum. The Zollverein, the customs union that Prussia had championed since 1834, was quietly accomplishing what diplomacy and war had not. By eliminating tariff barriers among most German states while excluding Austria, it created an economic sphere centered on Berlin. Goods flowed freely from the Rhineland to Silesia, from Hamburg to Munich, and with every transaction, the logic of German unity under Prussian leadership grew stronger. The railways accelerated everything. The first Prussian line opened between Berlin and Potsdam in 1838, a modest stretch of track that seemed almost ceremonial. Within 2 decades, thousands of kilometers of rail connected Prussian cities to coal fields, ports, and markets. The state recognized early that railways were not merely commercial ventures, but instruments of strategic power. Troops could be mobilized across vast distances in days rather than weeks. Raw materials could reach factories with unprecedented speed. The Prussian General Staff studied railway timetables with the same intensity it devoted to battlefield maps. The Ruhr Basin underwent a metamorphosis that would have been unrecognizable to the farmers who had worked its soil a generation earlier. Coal production surged as deep-shaft mining techniques opened seams that had been inaccessible. Around the pithead towers, entire cities materialized. Essen, Bochum, Duisburg, these names became synonymous with industrial might. The Krupp family's steelworks in Essen grew from a modest forge into the largest industrial enterprise in Europe, producing railway wheels, axles, and increasingly artillery pieces of terrifying precision. Worker housing spread in dense rows near the factories, brick tenements where families lived in conditions that bore no resemblance to the pastoral order the Junkers idealized. A new class was being born in these industrial districts, men and women whose loyalty belonged neither to the crown nor to the landed aristocracy, but to the rhythm of the factory bell. They would eventually demand representation, organization, and rights that the old Prussian constitution had never contemplated. Yet the Prussian bureaucracy adapted with characteristic efficiency. Technical universities trained engineers. State investment supported railway construction. Mining academies produced the expertise that kept coal flowing. The same administrative precision that had once counted soldiers and collected grain taxes now tracked industrial output and regulated commercial law. Prussia was becoming two kingdoms simultaneously, an agrarian East ruled by Junker officers and an industrial West driven by bourgeois capital, bound together by the iron discipline of the state. By the 1860s, the economic balance of power in Central Europe had shifted decisively. Austria, with its sprawling multinational empire and fragmented markets, could not match the concentrated industrial energy radiating from the Prussian-led customs union. The coal and steel of the Ruhr, the precision engineering of Berlin, the financial networks of Frankfurt, all of these resources awaited a political will capable of converting economic supremacy into national destiny. The furnaces burned day and night, and the smoke that rose from their chimneys drifted eastward across the plains like a signal of what was coming. The political will arrived in September of 1862, when King William I, locked in a constitutional crisis with his liberal parliament over military funding, summoned Otto von Bismarck to serve as minister-president. The appointment was an act of desperation. The king had considered abdication. Bismarck offered instead a strategy of defiance, informing the Budget Committee that the great questions of the age would be settled not by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. The phrase became legendary, but the method behind it was coldly precise. Bismarck understood that Prussian power required 3 wars, each carefully limited, each designed to isolate a single opponent and redraw the map of Central Europe before the other great powers could intervene. The first target was Denmark. In 1864, a dispute over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein provided the pretext. Bismarck maneuvered Austria into a joint war against the Danes, a calculated partnership that gave the campaign international legitimacy, while planting the seeds of a future quarrel over the spoils. Prussian and Austrian forces overwhelmed Danish defences at the Dibble fortifications in April. The duchies fell within months. The peace settlement divided administration of the conquered territories between the 2 German powers, an arrangement Bismarck designed to be unworkable. Every administrative friction between Prussian-governed Schleswig and Austrian-governed Holstein became a lever he could pull when the moment for the Second War arrived. That moment came in 1866. Bismarck provoked Austria into declaring war, ensuring that Prussia appeared the aggrieved party. The campaign lasted 7 weeks. Prussian armies, equipped with the needle gun that allowed soldiers to fire from prone positions and reload with devastating speed, shattered Austrian forces at the Battle of Königgrätz on the 3rd of July. Nearly 500,000 men clashed across the Bohemian hills in the largest battle Europe had witnessed since Leipzig. The victory was decisive, but Bismarck restrained the generals who wanted to march on Vienna. A lenient peace preserved Austrian dignity, while expelling Habsburg influence from German affairs forever. The North German Confederation emerged under Prussian leadership, binding the states north of the main river into a federal structure with Bismarck as its chancellor and the Prussian king as its president. The Third War required the most delicate orchestration. Bismarck needed the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, to join the Northern Confederation voluntarily, driven by patriotic fervor rather than Prussian coercion. A war against France would accomplish this. In July of 1870, Bismarck edited a diplomatic telegram, the famous Ems dispatch, making a routine exchange between King William and the French ambassador appear insulting to both nations. Napoleon III, politically weakened and goaded by his own press, declared war. The southern states honored their military treaties with Prussia and marched north. The Franco-Prussian War unfolded with mechanical efficiency. Prussian mobilization, perfected through railway logistics and general staff planning under Helmuth von Moltke, delivered overwhelming force to the frontier before French armies had fully assembled. At Sedan on the 1st of September 1870, an entire French army along with Napoleon himself surrendered. Paris endured a brutal siege through the winter. And in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, on the 18th of January 1871, the German princes proclaimed William I as German Emperor. The ceremony was deliberately staged in the heart of French royal splendor, a statement of power that humiliated the defeated nation and announced a new order in Europe. Prussia had not merely unified Germany, it had consumed the idea of Germany itself, fusing Prussian military tradition with German national identity into an empire of 65 million souls, stretching from the Rhine to the Vistula, from the North Sea to the Alps. The Iron Kingdom had become the Iron Empire. The Iron Empire needed an iron capital, and the city that received this burden was, by the standards of European grandeur, still remarkably young. Berlin in 1871 was not Paris, not Vienna, not London. It lacked their centuries of accumulated splendor, their layered architectural confidence, their deep cultural gravity. What it possessed instead was ambition on a scale that bordered on the ferocious, and the resources of a newly unified nation of 65 million determined to announce itself to the world. The transformation began almost immediately. Imperial revenues and Prussian administrative energy converged on the city with staggering force. The French war indemnity of 5 billion francs, extracted from a humiliated France, flooded the German economy with capital. Berlin became the epicenter of a speculative boom known as the Founders' Years, the Gründerzeit, when banks, factories, and construction companies multiplied with dizzying speed. Entire neighborhoods rose from sandy Brandenburg soil in months. The population, which had stood at roughly 800,000 at unification, surged past 1 million within a few years, drawing workers from Silesia, Pomerania, Saxony, and the Polish East into tenement blocks that stretched along newly laid boulevards. Those boulevards themselves told a story of conscious imperial design. Unted in linden, already the ceremonial spine of the old Prussian capital, was extended and embellished. The Kurfürstendamm was developed as a western avenue meant to rival the Champs-Élysées. Monumental buildings rose in rapid succession. The Reichstag, seat of the imperial parliament, was begun in 1884 and completed a decade later, its massive dome a deliberate symbol of national unity, crowning a building whose actual political power Bismarck carefully constrained. Museum Island expanded into one of Europe's greatest concentrations of cultural institutions, housing antiquities from Pergamon and Egypt alongside galleries of European painting. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church anchored the growing western districts. Railway terminals multiplied, connecting Berlin to every corner of the empire and to the continent beyond. Yet beneath the monumental facades, a more complex city breathed. Berlin's café culture flourished, drawing journalists, academics, and artists into establishments where political debate mixed with literary ambition. The university, already distinguished by the legacy of Humboldt's educational reforms, attracted scholars whose work in physics, chemistry, medicine, and philosophy placed Berlin among the world's foremost intellectual centers. Robert Koch identified the tuberculosis bacillus in his Berlin laboratory. Hermann von Helmholtz advanced the science of thermodynamics and perception. The city's concert halls and opera houses sustained a musical tradition that stretched back through Mendelssohn to the court of Frederick the Great. Military culture remained omnipresent. Garrison regiments paraded regularly along the central avenues, their precision a living advertisement of Prussian discipline. Officers in uniform occupied a social rank that civilian wealth alone could never purchase. The Junker aristocracy maintained its grip on the officer corps and the upper bureaucracy, even as industrial magnates accumulated fortunes that dwarfed old landed estates. This tension between old Prussian hierarchy and new capitalist energy defined Berlin's social atmosphere, producing a city simultaneously rigid and restless. Bismarck governed this expanding metropolis and the empire it commanded from the Wilhelmstrasse, orchestrating a complex system of alliances abroad while managing fractious domestic politics at home. He battled the Catholic Church in the Kulturkampf, then reversed course. He introduced pioneering social insurance legislation, creating sickness, accident, and old age pension systems that became models for the industrialized world, not from progressive conviction, but from calculated strategy to undercut the growing social democratic movement. Berlin's working-class districts became strongholds of organized labor, their red banners a persistent challenge to the conservative order. By 1890, when the young Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck, Berlin had become unrecognizable from the modest garrison town of a century before. It was an imperial capital of nearly 2 million, bristling with monuments, humming with industry, alive with intellectual ferment, and haunted by the unresolved contradictions between Prussian authority and democratic aspiration, between military tradition and modern ambition. The city had become the mirror of the empire itself, magnificent and unstable in equal measure. The machinery that made this empire function was not housed in palaces or parade grounds alone. It lived in thousands of unremarkable offices, austere schoolrooms, and regimented barracks scattered across the Prussian landscape, staffed by men whose names history never recorded, but whose collective labor sustained one of the most disciplined states Europe had ever produced. To understand Prussia at the height of its power, is to understand these servants of the state, the bureaucrats, teachers, and soldiers who formed the living architecture of Hohenzollern authority. The Prussian civil service had evolved across 2 centuries into an institution of remarkable precision. Entry required rigorous examination, years of unpaid apprenticeship, and demonstrated mastery of law, economics, and administrative science. A young man aspiring to join the higher bureaucracy faced 3 successive examinations spread across nearly a decade, each designed to eliminate those lacking intellectual stamina or institutional loyalty. The system produced officials who were methodical, incorruptible by the standards of the age, and deeply conscious of their role as guardians of rational governance. Ministry corridors in Berlin hummed with the quiet industry of men drafting regulations, reviewing petitions, and maintaining the vast paper infrastructure that connected provincial villages to the central state. Pension files accumulated in orderly rows, each life catalogued and accounted for with meticulous care. The schoolroom was Prussia's second great instrument of state formation. Universal compulsory education, established in principle under Frederick William I and expanded dramatically after the Napoleonic reforms, had by the late 19th century produced one of the most literate populations in Europe. Village schoolmasters, often poorly paid and socially modest, nonetheless wielded enormous influence over the formation of young minds. The curriculum emphasized reading, arithmetic, religious instruction, geography, and history, told through the lens of Hohenzollern achievement. Discipline was absolute. Children sat in ordered rows, stood when addressed, and absorbed lessons in obedience alongside lessons in grammar. The system created citizens who could read military orders, operate industrial machinery, and navigate bureaucratic procedures, precisely the skills an industrializing military state required. The barracks completed the trinity. Universal male conscription, refined after 1813 and maintained throughout the century, meant that virtually every Prussian man passed through military service. For 2 or 3 years, young men from Junker estates and urban tenements alike submitted to a regime of drilling, marching, weapons training, and absolute subordination to authority. The experience was transformative. Men entered as civilians and emerged shaped by habits of punctuality, hierarchy, and collective discipline that persisted long after discharge. Reserve obligations kept them connected to the military system for decades, ensuring that Prussian society remained saturated with martial values even in peacetime. Garrison towns like Potsdam and Brandenburg organized their entire social calendars around regimental life, their streets echoing with trumpet calls at dawn and the measured cadence of marching boots. These 3 institutions reinforced one another in ways both deliberate and organic. The bureaucrat who administered conscription had himself been conscripted. The teacher who instilled obedience had learned it in barracks. The soldier who followed orders without question had been educated in schools that rewarded compliance. The result was a society of extraordinary functional efficiency and deep structural rigidity, capable of mobilizing resources and manpower with speed that astonished foreign observers, yet increasingly resistant to the creative disorder that democratic politics and social change demanded. The very qualities that made Prussia formidable made it brittle, a paradox that would reveal itself with devastating clarity in the century ahead. The paradox announced itself in the very architecture of the new empire. The Constitution of 1871 created a German Reich, in which Prussia occupied a position of overwhelming dominance, yet the arrangement was designed to appear as something other than Prussian hegemony. The King of Prussia served automatically as German Emperor. The Prussian Minister-President served as Imperial Chancellor. Prussia controlled 17 of the 58 votes in the Bundesrat, enough to veto any constitutional amendment. 2/3 of the empire's territory and 3/5 of its population were Prussian. The German army was, in practice, the Prussian army expanded, its officer corps still drawn overwhelmingly from Junker families, its traditions and regulations those perfected in Potsdam and Berlin over generations. Yet this dominance created tensions that grew more corrosive with each passing decade. The empire contained kingdoms, grand duchies, and free cities with their own traditions and resentments. Bavaria maintained its own army in peacetime. The Catholic South regarded Protestant Prussian leadership with suspicion deepened by Bismarck's Kulturkampf, the campaign against Catholic institutional influence that raged through the 1870s. The Chancellor had intended to consolidate national loyalty by identifying Catholicism as a foreign allegiance. Instead, he united Catholic communities in defiant opposition, strengthening the Centre Party into a permanent political force that Prussian discipline could not simply command away. The social landscape was shifting beneath the Junker establishment with gathering speed. Industrialization, which Prussia had done so much to accelerate, was producing an urban working class whose interests aligned with neither the agrarian aristocracy nor the liberal bourgeoisie. The Social Democratic Party grew relentlessly, winning more votes in each successive Reichstag election, until by 1912 it became the largest party in the German parliament. Prussia's response revealed the empire's deepest contradiction. The Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, but the Prussian state parliament retained the three-class voting system that weighted ballots by tax contribution, ensuring that wealthy landowners controlled political outcomes regardless of popular sentiment. A Junker's vote could carry the weight of dozens of workers' votes. This arrangement was not accidental but deliberate, a mechanism to preserve the old order within the shell of the new. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who ascended the throne in 1888 and dismissed Bismarck 2 years later, embodied the empire's contradictions in his own restless personality. He craved modernity, yet romanticized medieval chivalry. He championed naval expansion and industrial power, yet surrounded himself with aristocratic officers who disdained commerce. His Weltpolitik, the pursuit of global influence through colonial acquisition and naval rivalry with Britain, reflected genuine economic ambitions, but also a dangerous need for prestige that destabilized the European balance Bismarck had carefully maintained. The military remained the empire's most prestigious institution and Prussia's most powerful export. The General Staff operated with near autonomy, planning for wars that diplomats had not yet imagined. Officers occupied a social position that no civilian rank could match. In Prussian cities, a reserve lieutenant's commission opened doors that wealth alone could not. This militarization of social prestige meant that the values of the barracks permeated civilian life in ways both visible and subtle, from the dueling culture of university fraternities to the rigid hierarchies of industrial management. By 1914, the empire Prussia had created was the most powerful state on the European continent, its industries outproducing Britain in steel, its universities leading the world in science, its army the most formidable military instrument in existence. Yet the political system remained frozen in arrangements designed for an agrarian kingdom, not an industrial superpower. The Junker class clung to privileges that demographic and economic reality had already undermined. The military planned for continental war with technical brilliance and strategic blindness. The monarchy confused spectacle with statecraft. Prussia had built Germany, but the Germany it built was developing needs, ambitions, and internal pressures that Prussian institutions were structurally incapable of addressing. A machine of extraordinary power, guided by a political imagination that belonged to a vanishing world. The machine broke in August of 1914, and it broke exactly as its designers had intended, which was the catastrophe. Prussian mobilization functioned with legendary precision. Within days, millions of reservists reported to their assigned railway stations, boarded trains running on schedules calculated years in advance, and moved westward through Belgium into France, according to plans drafted in Prussian staff offices. The army that had been the kingdom's reason for existence performed its mechanical function flawlessly. But the war it entered was not the war its planners had imagined. The Schlieffen Plan's promise of swift victory dissolved in the mud of the Marne, and by autumn the Western Front had congealed into a static nightmare of trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. For 4 years, the Prussian military system consumed the nation it was built to protect. The Junker officer corps that had commanded small professional armies now presided over industrial slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Verdun, the Somme, Tannenberg in the east, each battle devoured tens of thousands of lives in exchange for negligible territorial gain. By 1916, the military leadership under Hindenburg and Ludendorff had effectively displaced civilian government, creating a silent dictatorship that directed not only strategy, but economic production, labor allocation, and food distribution. Prussia's old dream of the army state had been realized in its most grotesque form. The collapse came with stunning speed. Ludendorff's spring offensive of 1918 exhausted Germany's last reserves. By autumn, the army was retreating, the navy mutinied at Kiel, and revolutionary councils sprang up across the country. On the 9th of November, the Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The Hohenzollern dynasty that had ruled Brandenburg Prussia for 5 centuries vanished in a single day. In Berlin, 2 competing republics were proclaimed within hours of each other, one social democratic, one socialist. The streets filled with armed sailors, deserting soldiers, and workers carrying red flags past the very monuments erected to celebrate Prussian military glory. What emerged from this chaos was paradoxical. The Weimar Republic preserved Prussia as its largest constituent state, containing 2/3 of Germany's territory and population. And this Prussian state became, against all historical expectation, a bastion of democratic governance. Under social democratic minister-presidents, particularly Otto Braun, who governed from 1920 to 1932, Prussia maintained a stable, progressive administration, while the national government lurched from crisis to crisis. Prussian police enforced republican law. Prussian civil servants administered welfare programs. The old bureaucratic efficiency now served democratic ends. But the Republic's enemies gathered strength. The economic devastation of the Great Depression after 1929 radicalized millions. The National Socialists exploited democratic freedoms to campaign for democracy's destruction. In Prussia's own parliament, Nazi delegates disrupted proceedings and brawled in corridors. The critical blow fell on the 20th of July, 1932, when Chancellor Franz von Papen, invoking emergency powers, dismissed the elected Prussian government in a bloodless coup. Brown's ministers were escorted from their offices by soldiers. The Prussian police, the Republic's most reliable armed force, passed under Reich control without resistance. Democrats who had inherited Prussian discipline obeyed the legal forms of their own destruction. When Hitler became Chancellor in January of 1933, Prussia offered no institutional resistance. Hermann Göring seized the Prussian Interior Ministry, purged the police, and transformed them into instruments of terror. The Reichstag fire in February provided the pretext for emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties across Germany. Prussia's administrative apparatus, built over centuries to execute orders with mechanical reliability, now executed orders of a fundamentally different character. The state that had once pioneered universal education and rational governance became the administrative framework through which totalitarian power organized itself, its legendary efficiency serving masters who would lead it toward absolute destruction. The efficiency served its new masters with terrifying completeness. Throughout the 1930s, Prussia ceased to exist as any meaningful political entity even before its formal death. The law for the reconstruction of the Reich in January of 1934 dissolved all German state parliaments and transferred sovereign powers to the central government. Prussia's ministries became appendages of the Reich. Its provinces became administrative conveniences. The Junker officer corps, once the backbone of Prussian military tradition, found itself absorbed into the Wehrmacht, where old regimental loyalties dissolved into a continental war machine answering to a single will. Some Prussian aristocrats would later conspire against that will. The July 20th plot of 1944 drew heavily on men shaped by Prussian traditions of duty and conscience. But their bomb failed, and the regime hanged them from meat hooks. The destruction that followed was biblical in scale. Allied bombers reduced Berlin to rubble between 1943 and 1945. Königsberg, the city where Prussian kings had crowned themselves since 1701, where Kant had spent his entire life contemplating reason, burned for days under British incendiary raids in August of 1944. Soviet forces completed its destruction the following spring. The Red Army's advance through East Prussia in early 1945 triggered one of history's largest forced migrations. Millions of Germans fled westward across frozen landscapes, by ship across the Baltic, in columns strafed by aircraft. Those who remained faced expulsion under the Potsdam Agreement. East Prussia was divided between the Soviet Union and Poland. Königsberg became Kaliningrad. The land where Prussia was born ceased to be German. On February 25, 1947, the Allied Control Council issued Law No. 46. The text was remarkably brief for so consequential an act. It declared that the Prussian state, which from early days had been a bearer of militarism and reaction in Germany, had de facto ceased to exist. It was hereby formally dissolved. No ceremony marked the occasion. No flag was lowered. A state that had existed in various forms for over 4 centuries simply vanished by administrative decree, its territories already divided among occupation zones that would soon become 2 separate Germanies. Yet abolition proved easier to decree than to accomplish in spirit. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, inherited Prussian administrative traditions so deeply embedded they were invisible. The professional civil service, the structured educational system, the municipal governance frameworks. The German Democratic Republic occupied the Prussian heartland of Brandenburg and built its capital in Berlin, though it claimed descent from peasant revolts rather than Hohenzollern kings. Sanssouci stood in East German territory, its gardens maintained, Frederick's grave unmarked by official commemoration. Reunification in 1990 reopened every question Prussia had posed. The restored state of Brandenburg surrounded Berlin once more. Potsdam's palaces became heritage sites drawing millions. Historians debated whether Prussian traditions of service and order represented a usable past or an irredeemable one. The Hohenzollern family's claims for restitution of confiscated properties provoked fierce public argument about whether descendants of a dynasty that had accommodated Nazism deserved compensation. Berlin's rebuilt palace, the Humboldt Forum, opened in 2021 on the site of the demolished Prussian royal residence, housing world cultures within a reconstructed Baroque facade, a monument to ambivalence itself. The ghost persists because the questions it raises remain unresolved. Can efficiency serve justice as readily as tyranny? Does discipline liberate or enslave? Prussia demonstrated both possibilities with equal conviction, producing Kant and the concentration camp bureaucracy, universal literacy, and unquestioning obedience. The state that no longer exists continues to shape the nation it created, its abolished name still carrying the weight of everything Germany has been and everything it struggles not to become. Thank you for joining this complete journey through the extraordinary history of Prussia. If these stories of the past have moved or informed you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next documentary exploration.